Today we're going to be talking about Guatemala, and I've shown you before where that is. It's a country in Central America, which I know is vague, but if you look at the bulletin, it shows that it's right near, it's between Mexico and Honduras and Belize, and Mickey Buck pointed out that she was in El Salvador, and her city even shows up on this map, so that's all good. But some of us brought some things to show you from Guatemala. I've shown you this cross before, right? That's a gift to the church. And I wore this for the first time on Easter. This is real typical of Guatemalan weaving. Is it bright? Yeah, it's really bright, isn't it? Who else has something to show the kids? Come on up, Mr. Smith.
What do kids everywhere like?
Answer him.
I'll give you a hint. Cookies. These are cookies that were made in Guatemala. So I have a pack of cookies for everybody here, if you're allowed to eat cookies. You're not allowed to eat cookies.
Wait till you get home, though, please.
Yeah, and if you're not allowed to eat them, give them back to me.
Or Ty's dad will have a lot of sweeping to do. That'll be a
And I
mess.
can guarantee they're very good because I've already tried a few myself.
Just a few.
Just a few. Yeah,
It's okay, Tegan. This is
Tegan, you want it?
he's a stranger to you, but he's a good person. You can trust him.
You want me to leave it here?
Yeah, just take it.
All right.
Thank you. And what are you wearing, Mr. Smith?
Well, I was going to talk
Oh, you're going to talk about that. Never mind. You'll talk about it later. Okay.
I'm mainly proving that I'm very secure in my masculinity. That's why I'm wearing it.
Okay. And anybody else have anything to show the kids today? I think Mrs. Carmazin does.
Well, first of all, when we went to Sedepka, the girls or women all got a bag. The men got a backpack. And one of the things that several in my family collect are nativities. So I have this little flower that has a tiny little nativity in the middle of it.
You see baby Jesus? Did you lose your cookies, Tegan? Tyson, hand them over. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Anybody else want to say anything?
I had this one because I think Mrs. Riccardi. So do you guys remember talking with Mrs. Riccardi in Presby's? And she talks about how we need to be good to the environment and the planet. So who can tell me what this is? You can pass it around. Yeah, it's an angel. But that angel is made of glass that used to be things like water bottles and plates and anything like that. So it's recycled glass, and they do a lot of recycled artwork in Guatemala. So they made us an angel.
Thank you. Did you like those things? And you'll find out later whether you like the cookies. And I hope you enjoy the pictures we have to show you, because I think they're pretty interesting. So let's have a prayer before you go back to your seats, okay? Gracious God, we're so happy to learn about other places where people love you and where you love them and where you are doing wonderful things. And we give you thanks always in the name of Jesus. Amen.
The gospel lesson is taken from Luke chapter 6, verses 17 through 26, the Beatitudes. Listen for the word of God. He came down with them and stood on a level place, with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. They had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. and all in the crowd were trying to touch him, for power came out from him and healed all of them. Then he looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. We're ready to roll. Meta, did you want to say anything first? Or? All right, I part of the Guatemala mission team, and as a way of introduction, I, number one, want to thank everyone in this congregation. Many, many heartfelt thank yous for all the support you've given us, both financially and spiritually. And your prayers, we felt your prayers the whole time we were there and up to then, and we still do. The session, the deacons, the Women's Association, and individual members who supported all our projects and fundraising things. One of the organizations who we have a relationship with is called SEDEPCA, and the acronym for that, loosely translated into English, is the Protestant Center for Pastoral Studies in Central America. And these folks know the drill. They know the terrain, they know how to get things done. They're really big on education, women's issues, healthcare, environmental issues. They kind of know Guatemala back and forth, and so we really enjoyed working with them. One of their quotes that they have is, "1 week is not enough time for you to change Guatemala, but 1 week is enough time for Guatemala to change you," and I can testify to that. It changed me. When I first thought about this trip, when our group was coming together, we decided we were going to do what's called an immersion trip. Now, I'm from the school of thought where when you go to something like this on a mission, you're doing hands-on stuff, brick and mortar, building houses, maybe digging wells, things like that. So I was a little skeptical, I guess to say the least. After spending a week there, I am really glad that we did it this way. We visited many more people, we went to many more places, we experienced many more problems, and saw many solutions that can be had for a lot of these problems. So it was very hands-on, and it really opened our eyes to the big picture, as it were. The 4 things that we looked at were education, women's issues, health, and migration. Those are the main focus. Other things that SEDEPCA does cover are environmental issues, humanitarian aid, social and political issues, and religion and spirituality. At first, and I mentioned it to the group the first couple days, I was just overwhelmed. It's like, my goodness, the problems are so vast and so numerous. How can we do anything? After being there and working with the folks at SEDEPCA, you finally realize that small steps, things are being done. They're doing things to help the people help themselves, and we can help facilitate change and bring justice and get those people to really help themselves and build a better society for themselves. So small steps are important. The people we met had very little in material possessions. What they did have was right here. They had in their heart. They had a divine sense of grace, and you saw it everywhere, and it just poured out into everybody. Finally, you realize that people everywhere have one thing in common. People in Salem, Ohio, people in Syria, people in Guatemala. They want their children to do better. And that's what they were all about. They wanted their kids to get educations. They wanted them to have a roof over their heads. They wanted them to be economically healthy and be able to feed themselves and have food. The lesson I just read, I'm just going to add this. Those people were blessed, and when reading the Beatitudes, they are blessed. And having been there and experienced those people, I too feel truly blessed.
Good morning. This morning, it is my job to share a few important facts with you about the history of Guatemala, which really gives context to everything we did. These facts were presented to us by a professor named Hector Castañeda. He is a professor of sociology. He's taught throughout Guatemala and at American universities, and he is a professor at SEDEPCA's Theological Seminary. As we sat in this stark white classroom that's adjacent to SEDEPCA's courtyard, Hector told us that if we're to understand the complicated and sad history of Guatemala, we really need to remember 5 dates, 5 years. 1492, 1821, 1944 through 54, 1996, 2015, and I would personally add one more, and that's 31. In 1492, the Spanish came to conquer Guatemala with a lethal and skilled military. Dr. Castañeda explains that it did not take long for the native people of Guatemala to become, for all intents and purposes, slaves to the Spanish. Points of conflict between the indigenous people and their Spanish conquerors revolved around 2 topics. The first was religion, because the Spanish also brought Catholic priests and Catholic traditions with them. The second was women. Spanish soldiers, merchants, and officials often took native women as their own and had propagated a new generation of Ladinos, a people who have both Spanish and native blood. By 1515, Guatemala's people had suffered an identity crisis that continues today. In fact, the Ladino people were often marginalized, and along with natives, Ladinos were denied education by law. By 1821, which was our second date, the Ladino population had grown substantially in numbers and had overtaken both the native and the Spanish populations. But the political power still remained in the hands of wealthy landowners, many of whom were Spanish. Ladinos did not wrest power away from the Spanish, but rather shared in their power, and they sort of rewrote an official history of Guatemala and created a system of land ownership that only further marginalized the indigenous people. These new norms were enforced as a part of a police state. Native Guatemalans were still denied education, as they would continue to be until 1944. By the 1940s, which is our third date, things were changing in Guatemala, and Dr. Castañeda and other academics believe that this change was due in large part to the introduction of liberation theology. That is to say, it's a Christian movement that emphasizes liberation from social, political, and economic oppression as an anticipation of Christ's ultimate salvation. In 1946, free elections were held for the first time. An independent judiciary was established, Social Security and labor laws came into effect. Natives and women were allowed to be educated for the first time in Guatemala's history. Between 1946 and 1951, a time that we would consider a time of great progress and prosperity, 149 coups d'etat were attempted. After several debates over tax structure and land tenure, and along with the global communist scare, the 150th coup attempt succeeded in 1954 with the help of the CIA. 6 years later, the violence began when left-wing guerrilla groups began fighting against the dictatorship that had come to power. Some call it a civil war, others call it an armed conflict, others still call it a genocide of the native Mayan population. Regardless of nomenclature, it would last for 36 years. At that time, Hector, our professor, was 22 years old and a college student. He decided that things had gone terribly wrong when he saw a Mayan ice cream vendor beaten within an inch of his life in the street for saying 4 words, down with the government. In 1996, with the help of the Catholic Church, the war stopped and peace accords were signed, but they have yet to be faithfully implemented in most parts of the country. Between 1960 and 1996, 200,000 people were killed, while another 50,000 disappeared. It has been concluded that 83% of the casualties of the armed conflict in Guatemala were Mayan. 93% of rights violations were carried out by the government and government agents. By 2015, our last date, Guatemalans felt free to stand in ways that had been unheard of since 1954, namely through protests against the government and its corruption, and through a free and independent press. These posters that you see are plastered throughout Guatemala City and another major city called Xela. They shed light on the government's role in the violence of those 36 years. These posters translate to 35 years not forgotten, 35 years of impunity. I told you there was one other year I wanted you to remember, and that's 31. Today is my 31st birthday. 31 is also the number of years that Hector Castañeda's brother got on this earth. Hector's brother, Jose Leon Castañeda, was a 31-year-old journalist. He was kidnapped, and later Hector would find out was tortured and killed by a sheriff's deputy. He was one of 92 journalists killed during the armed conflict at the hands of the Guatemalan government. 3 months after Jose disappeared, his wife was gunned down in the street. Their children call Hector Dad. The two things that Hector impressed on us when we left his classroom was that every family in Guatemala has a story like this. The other is that he forgives the men and the systems who killed his family because hate is too great a burden to bear.
As Mark stated, we worked with a group from Guatemala known as SEDEPCA. And one particular individual with that group by the name of Leslie was what I would call our lifeline. I chose this fearless leader because I felt she related to each of us as she was an American citizen, and she corrected me by saying a U.S. citizen. She was a Presbyterian minister, and she was the mother of two. She is a mission co-worker serving the Presbyterian World Mission in Guatemala. She works as a facilitator for the Intercultural Encounters program of the Protestant Center for Pastoral Studies in Central America, known as SEDEPCA. Leslie helps groups to discover Guatemala in all its diversity, beauty, and complexity, and to experience the everyday life of Guatemalans. Growing up a child of two Presbyterian missionaries, she states, led her to her ministry with SEDEPCA. She said she has been guided by a sense of calling expressed best by the Hebrew prophet Micah. What does God require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? This calling has challenged Leslie by leading her to serve as a bridge between peoples and cultures on a grassroots level. Leslie was part of the team that received our group, planned and facilitated our itinerary, and acted as our interpreter. Every evening, she and Meta led our evening reflection and discussions, asking us each day where we saw God. I feel that God led us to this beautiful country, although it wears such an ugly label. I felt that Leslie, as I stated before, was our lifeline in Guatemala. In Central America, we encountered families who are facing life-threatening and life-altering situations that have amazing courage and love for Christ. Leslie and I spoke about discipleship, and that the Guatemalan women, amid great suffering, still have their faith in Christ. This reality changed the way that Leslie reads and interprets the Bible. SEDEPCA works to implement transformative education with women and men all over Guatemala, striving to address the causes of poverty and cultures of violence, with an understanding that women and children are the largest majority of the poor and of those targeted by violence. Guatemala is the most populous and most industrialized country in Central America, but it also is by far the country with the highest percentage of the indigenous population. In conversation with Leslie, she shared with me that she loves introducing groups to the work SEDEPCA does with the indigenous women and children. In her assignment with SEDEPCA, Leslie perceives a strong connection with her faith journey. She states, "I look forward to opportunities to work with the teams of people from the U.S. who are seeking to engage in the experiences that may change her own life, that changed her own life so many years ago. Amongst the drab and downtrodden shines the beauty of a country that I personally find difficult to explain. Every place we visited, women and children would come from hiding to welcome all of us and Leslie with a hug. Guatemalans are very guarded, so this was quite unusual. She emanates a kindness and a love for the people. Our team of travelers bonded well as a group. Leslie was patient with each of us, answering questions, pointing out sites, and asking where we saw God each day. She helped to give each of us a clearer understanding of the things that we struggled with. Our first encounter with the women and children left each of us saying, wow. As a mother of 5, I saw and heard time after time that all these women wanted for their children was for them to become better educated than they themselves were, or for them to have a better life. The hard work and sacrifices that these beautiful indigenous women and families make for their children are really no different than what we do here in Salem. I want nothing for my own children any different than what she wanted. What we take for granted, they would sell their souls for. As Mark stated, the one thing I said time after time is that we love the same. Mothers all love their children the same. She wants for her babies the same as we want for ours. Throughout our entire stay, everywhere we went, it was people wanting to better themselves and help others to do so. Devoted Christians helping others. There are no words to define the children's faces as they sang happy birthday to Michael, a stranger, ate dinner with us, talked about their own dreams or desires, or the grandmother's voice as she told about the story of raising her 8 grandchildren. Each tiny smile told me that we were meant to be there. I want to thank each of you and Meta for allowing me to participate in this experience. I believe that your congregation answered God's call by working to make it possible for the members of your church to begin building a relationship with SEDEPCA and the Guatemalan people. I don't think a minute for mission, or even this hour, is long enough to share with you the amazing experience and work being done thanks to your generous donations of monies and your yarn, your prayers, or your mission workers, and I quote that like Mark did, helped create neighbors in another country that could possibly help your neighbors right here in Salem, just a block away. I highly recommend that you begin plans for your next group to return to Guatemala to continue the work that you've started. You will not fix what is wrong, but loving our neighbors is what God has called us to do. After returning home, I found numerous struggles with the little things because they don't seem so important anymore. They're much smaller. A week ago, Leslie and I had a talk where I stated that I'm not sure I will ever look at things the same. She said to me, I think they should put a label on these trips, warning. Participation in this experience could change the direction of your life permanently. And I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
Just wanted to mention that last picture with the pickup truck with the welded-on canopy. That was a Guatemalan tour bus. And ask anybody here what the ride was like up to the top of the volcano on that. It was, I think Lauren mentioned she was in the front seat and she could feel the brakes banging when he hit the brakes going down with a 1,000-foot drop-off on the edge. So it was something else. After Leslie, the next person we met when we got off the plane at the airport was a gentleman named Freddy Mejia. And that's Freddie there at the bus. And he was our kind of factotum, major domo, general all about do everything guy. Just a great guy, a great spirit. I put he was cheerful, helpful, courteous. He was a real Boy Scout. I mean, he fit all the Scout laws, and he was extremely competent in everything he did. Having been a professional truck driver in my life, 5 minutes driving in Guatemala would have left me a quivering mass of jello. And he went through places and sidled up next to buildings and cars that you couldn't put your finger between our vehicle and them. And just an amazing guy. I had the opportunity to kind of talk Spanglish back and forth with Freddie. His English was about as good as my Spanish. He'd spent a year in LA working, but he was totally immersed in a Spanish-speaking community there. So you talk to him, and about the only thing he picked up in LA was LA Lakers and Kobe Bryant. But we were trying to teach each other the language, and I would put my foot in my mouth. Lauren's there laughing because she knows Spanish pretty well, and she'd just get a little grin on her face when I'd ever put my foot in it, you know. And I asked Freddie what the chicken buses were, which you saw in the picture, and I think Jody's going to mention. And Freddie said the buso pollo, chicken bus. Well, I thought he said puco pollo, which means whore's bus. And Freddie just kind of gave me a look like, and another time he was always tying our luggage on top of the van, and he would tie it in with a rope, and I would say el ropo, which means in Spanish, clothes. So do you want clothes? I'm thinking it was rope. So, you know, Lauren would just sit there and kind of grin at me. Another time, I think I asked him for el fuego, which means fire, and he was looking for a light. But we had a good time, and he was just a great. And he needed a flashlight. So, just a great guy, just a wonderful companion, and I think I made a friend on this trip because he kind of exemplified the whole attitude of the Guatemalan people, just a wonderful person. Our first day in the country, we traveled to a town called Chimaltenango, which is in the province where the Cochiquel Mayans are indigenous to. Like, one thing about the Mayans, everybody thinks the Mayans, well, it's sort of like the Scottish clans. There's the Quiche, the Cochiquel, the Mam. I think there were 22 separate indigenous Mayan groups. They all spoke a different language, and it wasn't Spanish. But, you know, it just kind of gives you, and reading the history, the Cochiquel allied with the Spanish because they wanted to defeat the Quiche, and then they did defeat the Quiche, and then, of course, things didn't work out real well with the Spanish either for them. So that's, but anyhow, the first day we went to a place called the Corazon du Mujer, which is the heart of women, is what that comes out in translation, and it was a weaving cooperative. And it was set up for women who had been widowed by the violencia, or the internal armed struggle, as they say in the vernacular, and women whose husbands had deserted them for various reasons. And they made these beautiful weavings and told us their stories. So one of the scarves I'm wearing, I'll get to that in a minute, is, and I asked Grace, I said, well, what's the quality like on those? And she said, oh, it's incredible, the quality of these weavings. One of the things they told us, they have issues marketing their products. They try to get in 10,000 villages and things like that, and it's not that easy to do. They do have a website, and it's corazonscarves.com if anybody's interested. Ask me later if you're interested. They shared a wonderful lunch with us, fresh fruit, chicken stew with, believe me, every part of the chicken in it. Wonderful vegetables, a fruit juice, and an excellent green sauce. I mean, In fact, I found some down at the little bodega down on Columbiana and Columbia Street. But we heard their stories. There was an older woman that came to that co-op. She walked an hour, caught a chicken bus, and rode 3 hours to get to this co-op and work with these other women. And the fare to ride a chicken bus was 8 quetzals, which is about $1 American money. So, and that's a lot of money to them. So she really wanted to get there. Now, the lady who wove my scarf, now I'll explain the scarf real quick. The story of the scarf, they had a lottery. And you picked a number and you put it in a hat, and I never win anything. Well, the way they do it down there, they pick 2 numbers, and then the 3rd number is the winner. So guess what? That's so I like the way they do things down there, because I'm usually the 3rd number drawn anytime. So, and Jim here was the 1st number. So, but and you know, and I was going to buy Grace a blue scarf, so it worked out real well. But Dora's story is, Dora was a young lady during the violence, the violencia. Her father was murdered by the army, and she told us she was just happy that 2 weeks later they dumped his body in a field near their house, so they had a body that they could bury properly. Her mother was frequently visited by the soldiers, and her mother would send the kids to play in the fields while the soldiers visited with her mother. Her grandmother had her throat slit, but here she is still here carrying on, making scarves and taking care of her children. And a recurring theme that you got is they keep telling them and telling us, we want to stay here and do better for ourselves and do better for our country. And you're going to hear more stories like this. It was a recurring theme, the horrible things, and you know, I don't want to get too graphic, but the things that were done to the people, the indigenous people. But the whole thing was, stay here, make our country better, and do well for yourselves here. And SEDEPCA is really doing a great job enabling that attitude. So thank you.
The story I will be telling is of a woman named Tola. She lived in a village in the northwest of Guatemala. During the 1980s, her village was attacked by the Guatemalan military. The men of her village were gathered and taken away. This included her husband. She and her 3 children ran and hid in the forest. The military left, however, they continued to come back. She was sexually assaulted during these returning visits. Weeks later, her husband was found in a field where he was left for dead. He was barely alive. They tried for 2 months to nurse her husband back to health. However, they could not, and he died. She was alone with her children with no means of support. During the 1980s, the government destroyed 600 indigenous villages and killed 250,000 people. Of this number, 50,000 were disappeared. Those people were taken by helicopter and either dropped in the jungle, ocean, or into volcanoes. This was all revealed from records kept by the military. The number killed represents about 5% of Guatemala's population. Bartola found help for her family from Christian organizations. Her son and 2 daughters eventually left for the United States. It was their firm belief that if they could make it to the United States, they could solve a lot of their hardships by the money sent back. Bartola stayed with her 4 grandchildren to raise them. These were hard-wrenching decisions. The 2 daughters did make it to the United States. However, they lost contact with her son. It was eventually found out that her son had died in the southwestern desert of Arizona. His identity was later confirmed by DNA. Bartola was grateful to find out what had happened to her son. The daughters were able to find jobs and send money back home. One daughter lives in Maryland, the other in Virginia. By this time, Bartola was in terrible debt, thousands of dollars due to medical debt and the loans she had arranged for passage of her children to the United States. Her ancestral land had also been put up as collateral. The loans were made with people who charged 20% interest, and the loans have come down, but there is still much owed. The guides, or coyotes as they are called, were to help her get her children to the United States border. The coyotes could either be good or terribly cruel people. Migrants were often abandoned, robbed, and trafficked. I stood with Bartola as she expressed her pleas to God. We both prayed to God to bring her relief and help for the many problems facing her family. Despite all the terrible tribulations she has endured, she continues to hold strong in her faith in Jesus Christ. I continue to pray for Bartola and her family. What was done decades ago continues to have consequences to this day. I pray to Jesus that the people of Guatemala will someday come to have a just society where God's love rules. This trip has left me with the following: that we should hold on tightly to our faith in Jesus Christ no matter what comes our way in life, and that we should stand and support other people in their faith as well. Thank you.
This past week, my husband Steve and I went to Cleveland to attend the funeral of his Aunt Maureen. And she was the last in either of our families from the greatest generation. And one thing that the officiant at her funeral emphasized was that although Maureen's own education was interrupted by her father's death, she and her husband, who was also denied the opportunity for education, made it an absolute priority that their children be educated. And in fact, all four of them are college graduates. Maureen herself returned to school when she was in her 50s because she just thought it was that important to get her college degree. Maureen's late brother, my father-in-law, often said that the great thing about the United States is that every generation wants the next generation to do better. What we found is that that conviction is shared by the people of Guatemala. Again and again, we heard, particularly from the mothers, that what they wanted for their children was to be educated. One gentleman who is working creatively on that effort is Hector de Leon. We visited him at his office at an agency called CIPA, where he explained to us that he runs a school for children who are forced by economic circumstance to work in the marketplace, often beginning at 4 a.m. And so these children come to school at an alternative time. They come beginning about 1 in the afternoon. CIPA knows that it is not the answer for all Guatemalans to move to the United States. Part of the drive for the children to be educated is that they might be able to find decent work at home. But Hector told us that almost every family with whom he works has someone here, someone in the USA. And the why of that is very simple. Guatemalan parents want their children to be educated, and even more urgently, they do not want them to die or be crippled from malnutrition. A very good resource for finding out about other countries is the Fact Book, which you can find online, and it's put out by our own CIA. It tells us that 1/2 of Guatemalan children under age 5 are chronically malnourished, one of the highest malnutrition rates in the world. Hector told us that the nourishing snack, which is served at the CIPA schools, may be the only real nutrition that some students will receive all day. When I first returned from Guatemala, I found myself repeating a couple of stories many times, and one was the statistic Hector shared with us that a basic survival income for a family of 4 would be about 65 quetzales per month. That's less than $1,000. Hector himself, as an educated man, as a teacher, earns 3,500 quetzales or about $500, much more than someone without an education could ever earn. But Guatemala's GDP per capita is roughly half the average for Latin America and the Caribbean. So we asked Hector, who is trying to keep youth in Guatemala, we asked him whether he had any family here himself, and he proudly told us that his brother is a United States citizen and a custodian at Princeton University. And he said that without his brother's contributions to the family, it would be very difficult for the family in Guatemala to support their mother. But because the brother sends money back, they can provide for her emotionally while he provides financial resources. We learned along the way that the average remittance sent from the United States back to Guatemala, and you've seen the places on State Street that do this, the average remittance is $375 a month. So, if you may observe that some of our neighbors live in crowded conditions or in ways that we might not find helpful or healthy, this is why. They're supporting their parents or their children. They are perhaps providing for education there, and they are certainly trying to stave off starvation there. We are not very different as peoples. The hopes and dreams of the greatest generation, Aunt Maureen and my own parents, the hopes they had for their families are not very different at all from the hopes and dreams of the people of Guatemala.
One of the great privileges of this trip was to meet quite a few of the peasant people that lived there. Leslie Vogel, our trip leader, had gotten to know many of these people over the years, and for those of you who have traveled in the world, it's wonderful to see sights and to relax and to do incredible things. But really, what you bring home from all of it that's most important, at least to me, is the people that you meet and how they touch your heart. And one of the privileges that we had in this trip was to meet a fellow, a peasant that Leslie had known for a few years. His name is Jose Zepp, and he makes flutes and sells them to anybody he can find to try to support his family. Jose was born to a family of 4 children. And he was one of 3 boys, and when he was only 1 during the armed conflict, his father was kidnapped by the army and killed, and so his mother had to move on to move to his grandparents' house and try to raise the children. His mother only lived till he was 8 years old, and then she passed away. And the grandfather continued to raise those children, of which he is one. So he learned how to make flutes to sell to support the family. And they had sold these flutes in one of the cities that we were lucky enough to visit, called Anguilla. And they had a very hard life there, he told us. So he continued to live and struggle there when he was a child. And then when he was about 19, his grandfather, who he loved dearly, said, hey, it's time to move out and be on your own. And his flute-making skills had been improving, and he found a hard-working woman, and they got married, and he built a house. And he also, with his wife, had 4 children. And those kids are alive and doing fairly well down there today. They are, the oldest is a daughter that's in 9th grade right now. He has a son that also is about to enter grade 9, and 2 younger children, another daughter that's in 4th grade and a son that's only 3. But they struggled desperately to find the money to get those kids educated so they can get certificates and degrees that will allow them to get jobs. It's very important down there to get jobs. You really need some. It really helps to have some credentials. And so even grade school educations or 9th grade educations or working certificates that we would find fairly common back here, are huge things for them to try to acquire for their kids. He now lives in a town called Provola, outside of Sheila, quite a ways outside of Sheila. He has to commute to sell. They're lucky to sell flutes. If they can find people even once a month to sell flutes to, and this is one that Jody had purchased while we were down there. Even if they can find a group like ours just once a month, he said it made all the difference in survival for his family. So they're trying anything they can to scratch out a living down there. But he was a privilege to come across and to know, and he spoke very kindly and humbly. And one thing that all these people, with all their difficult, horrible stories, they all seem to come, the ones that have survived, that come through with so much love for not only their families but for friends, and compassion for others that they showed us while we were down there, and kindness that they didn't have to. I mean, it's just a natural part of them. You can tell it just pours out of them, and it's hard not to love them back. But the interconnectedness that they shared with each other and extending now to here to Ohio, it was really wonderful to experience.
We're almost done, I promise. Buenos dias. Good morning. On Thursday morning, we went to one of our many meetings. That day, we went to the Cultural Center. There, we learned about the women's ministry today in Guatemala. We were in a small auditorium that sat about 80 people. All in attendance were women, except for Michael, Mark, and Jim. It was all in Spanish. It was all on a PowerPoint presentation. These women talked about the abuse Guatemala went through, their rights, and their lack of rights. We went to hear one of the ladies from SEDEPCA. Her name was Nellie Miranda. Nellie is the head of the Biblical Theological Seminary at SEDEPCA, and she also is the first woman to run for the Bishop of Guatemala in the Episcopal Church. While we were there, we saw Julia Escobar, an exiled poet, get an award, and to hear her read one of her many poems. She had wrote these poems about the 30 years in which Guatemala suffered the unspeakable violence, political violence. She wrote of a time many thousands of Mayan, Quiche, and the other indigenous groups were savagely murdered. Hundreds of villages were literally wiped off the face of the earth. Julia emerged as a voice of the peaceful, nonviolent resistance and used her pen to tell the world about the immense suffering her people endured. And I would like to share the poem that she read to us, to you. Now, the people in the pictures you're going to see are all the people that we met and had the privilege of hearing their story. So they have threatened us with resurrection. It isn't the noises of the streets that keeps us from resting, my friend, nor is it the shouts of the young people coming out drunk from the St. Pauli, nor is it the tumult of those who pass by excitedly on their way to the mountains. It is something within us that doesn't let us sleep, that doesn't let us rest, that won't stop pounding deep inside. It is the silent, warm weeping of the Indian women without their husbands. It is the sad gaze of the children fixed somewhere beyond memory precious in our eyes, which during sleep, though closed, keep watch, systole and diastole, awake. Now 6 have left us, and 9 in Ravenna, and 2 + 2 + 2, a whole army witness to our pain, our fear, our courage, our hope. What keeps us from sleeping is that we have been threatened us with resurrection, because every evening, though weary of killings and endless inventory since 1954, yet we go on loving life and do not accept this death. They have threatened us with resurrection, because it isn't felt in their inert bodies and their souls penetrated ours, doubly fortified, because in this marathon of hope, there are always others to relieve us, who carry the strength to reach the finish line, which lies beyond death. They have threatened us with resurrection, because they will not be able to take away from us their bodies, their souls, their strength, their spirit, not even their death, and at least of all, their life, because they live today, tomorrow, and always in streets baptized by blood, in the air that absorbed their cry, in the jungle that hid their shadows, in the river that gathered up their laughter, in the oceans that hold their secrets, in the creators of the volcanoes, pyramids of the new day, which swallow up their ashes. They have threatened us with resurrection, because they are more alive than ever before, because they transform our agonies and fertilize our struggles, because they pick us up when we fall, because they loom like giants before their crazed gorillas fear. They have threatened us with resurrection, because they do not know life, poor things. That in the whirlwind which does not let us sleep, the reason why sleeping we keep watch, and awake we dream. Not in the street noises, nor in the shouts of the drunks from the St. Pauli, nor the noises from the fans from the ballpark. It is the internal cyclone of catastrophic struggle which will heal the wound of the Quetzal, fallen in Exxon. It is the earthquake soon to come that will shake the world and everything in its place. No, brother, it is not the noise in the streets which does not let us sleep. Join us in this vigil, and you will know what it is to dream awake, to keep watch asleep, to live while dying, and know ourselves ready, already resurrected. We, and I mean Meta, Lauren, Jim, Mark, Michael, and Jennifer, were gone for 10 days. Was it a vacation? No. We were busy learning about the values and beliefs of the Guatemalan people. We were there to have our intercultural encounter. This is about education that transforms. Nellie Miranda, the lady at the women's thing, asked us to look at the methodology of acting on a situation. See, judge, and then act. Reflect on the current realities. Then go to the Bible and see what the Bible says about our reality issues. Finally, ask ourselves, how are we called to respond as followers of Jesus? Since we have come back, I have said we've been blessed with a lot of burdens. I should be saying we've been burdened with a lot of blessings. We have so much and feel we need more. The Guatemalan people have so little, and their faith overflows with abundance of hope. It is their love of family that stood out to me. They want their children to have a better life than they have. They want their children to live in a better place, to have more and better opportunities, to not go to bed hungry, to have a roof over their heads, to get an education. Does this sound familiar? Because those are the same things we all want for our own children. So what did I get from this experience? Confirmation that God's love is with us always, in good times and in bad. He gives us the strength we need, and he provides us what we need when we need it. So never, never doubt him. Thank you once again for letting us have this experience. And if you have any questions, we will be glad to answer them. Thank you.